Police who had to arrest other police. What happened? My dad was the arresting officer of an undercover narcotics detective for the murder of 2 fellow officers. From what I remember, the 2 officers and a technician caught him by surprise while he was stealing from an evidence room. He shot the 2 officers first and his firearm jammed, so the technician escaped. Detective got life in prison and died there. I actually have had to arrest 3 separate members of the justice system this year. First, a practicing lawyer and former judge who had been utilizing his position to coerce sex from defendants. He utilized this leverage even after he was not a judge anymore. Investigation by DCI revealed he had about a dozen victims, so a warrant for his arrest was made, which I executed. Arresting a guy you used to put defendants in front of is a very odd feeling. He weaseled out of prison time and got it all suspended and put on a direct supervision probation program. Absolute horseshit. I've seen guys do way less get way more time, but it's not really a secret that money has a habit of tipping the scales of justice. Next was a prison guard whom strangled his girlfriend, then stalked her relentlessly. I actually arrested him twice because after he posted bail on the first one, he was spotted lurking outside her home only 45 minutes after being released. He's currently in on felony assault, strangulation of a household member, and felony violation of a protection order. He's still in my jail awaiting trial with a bail that has been substantially increased. I'm anticipating prison time for him, but only time will tell. Third was a city police officer. I'm a county deputy sheriff because we received a call from a 6-year-old that his dad was in the garage doing drugs and wouldn't come out. Showed up to find 4 very young kids running around unsupervised. It was a city police officer smoking meth that he had confiscated during a traffic stop and not reported or turned into evidence. DCI took the case from us due to potential conflict of interest and have placed him in another county's jail, and I haven't heard any more about it. Hope he does time too. What kinda asshole leaves his little kids totally alone and unsupervised while they smoke meth? Especially when said person is a fucking cop. Unforgivable in my opinion. But yeah, 2020 has been a very strange year for me. Not me, but my dad, who was a cop. He was still working as a full-time cop before switching full-time to firefighting and made a traffic stop around 11 at night back in the mid-80s. Nicer car, speeding well over the speed limit, so my dad initiates a stop. Before he is out of his cruiser, the driver has what looks like a badge hanging out of the window. My dad walks up, does the usual song and dance, and the driver said, "You obviously can't freaking see who I am." My dad says, "Yes, Lieutenant Colonel, I do, and right now I'm conducting a traffic stop." Turns out the driver was a lieutenant colonel in the Ohio State Highway Patrol, which is pretty high up in their rank structure. My dad again asks him for license and insurance, and the guy goes off, threatening to call Dick, as in Dick Sellers, who was governor at the time, and threatening his job, that he was just trying to get back to Columbus after an engagement and so on. Eventually he calls for backup and has another officer there to witness what was going on. Eventually my dad writes him a ticket, and while still screaming, Mr. Pullingrank drives away. The next shift my dad gets called in by his assistant chief and is asked about the stop, and apparently the colonel of OSHP was calling him about it. In the end they had to bring in the other officer to write a statement of what went on, and in the end nothing came of it except the ticket wasn't contested and paid. Probationary officer goes on a blind double date with his roommate. Been at the racetrack drinking, so they take the train to downtown. Everyone is pretty drunk, him in particular. Maybe to entertain or show off for his date, he is acting goofy. As everyone is getting off the train, he sees some guy bent over tying his shoes. Rocket scientist decides to leapfrog over the guy, only neither of them have much balance. Probationary cop basically jumps over / on the guy and drives his face straight into the pavement because he is too drunk and the guy wasn't expecting it. Everyone jumps up and he starts trying to defuse the situation he just caused. Turns out the guy is a 17-year-old kid heading down to spend the weekend with his grandparents and has 2 broken teeth and a broken nose. The drunk cop starts saying stuff like, "It's okay, it will be fine, I'm a cop, it's all good." When he realizes the crowd isn't going to let him just walk away, he foot bails and tries to run off. A few guys chase him down and grab him. Cops get called and detain him. I was the on-call detective who was called out at 22:30 to handle the case. He refused to answer any questions and was booked in for felony battery based on the extent of injuries and age of victim. He never made it off probation and resigned. Ex-sheriff's deputy here. One night on shift I had the great misfortune to overhear on the radio that a small local chief of police, the whole department was only 3 people, was not answering a radio call. So my shift partner goes out to the call that they were trying to get him to go to, and I make my way to try and locate this chief of police. On my way to the police station thinking maybe he's just asleep on the couch, I see his squad car pulled off onto the side of the road, lights going. In that moment my heart sank. My first thought was, oh no, this dude just got killed on a traffic stop. As I'm walking up to the car in a hurry, I noticed that he slumped over. I reached into the open driver's window and grabbed his shoulder to try and put my fingers against his neck to feel if he has a pulse or if his skin is still warm, and generally check to see if he is in fact still alive. As I'm doing this, I notice a distinct and strong odor of alcohol. As the chief of police wakes up, looks at me, puts the car in drive and pulls away. About that time another deputy pulls up behind my car and I put out my radio that the chief is driving off. The other deputy, forgetting that we all use a shared frequency, then comes over the radio and says hey, he should be easy to follow, his lights are on. The lights go off. Fast forward to several hours later. Command staff is out at the police department, seizing the weapons and evidence that's stored within the department. This chief of police shows up with the mayor of the small town and submits himself to a breathalyzer. He barely passes. Fun fact, district attorneys do not like prosecuting chiefs of police, especially when politics are starting to get involved. Unrelated to that, I was let go about 2 weeks later for calling a suspect an asshole. Unprofessional conduct. Former police officer and correctional officer here. I never actually arrested a fellow cop myself. However, my field training officer was arrested and fired from my former PD twice for drunk and disorderly. Before I worked there, he got his job back twice through union arbitration and, to his credit, gave up drinking. When I was working at the jail, we had a cop who was put into protective custody / suicide watch after being arrested for stalking a woman he met on a call. He got obsessed with her and kept bothering her after the fact, and after she reported him, he made threats against her. A fellow CO at my jail was arrested for producing and distributing child pornography. He got girls as young as 9 to send him nude photos, which he distributed on the dark web. He's doing 25 years in prison minimum. He won't be eligible for parole for another 15 years or so. We had 7 officers at the jail beat a disabled inmate and then lie about it on their reports. The shift commander then tried to erase the video. All were fired and arrested, but were later acquitted of all charges. Sad thing was, they were all guilty as hell. I'm an actual cop, so I'll give an answer. I've arrested 12 cops for DUI, 2 of which included charges of possessing weapons while intoxicated. I've arrested 1 cop for writing a check on a closed account. Another for violating protection order during a very ugly divorce. I assisted the feds on a couple tax-related arrests. I've also arrested a total of 3 cops for dereliction of duty. One of those cops was a cop who didn't arrest or conduct a DUI investigation after a crash involving another cop. All those cases proceeded in a similar fashion as other people with similar backgrounds / criminal records would have with similar offenses. The slap on the wrist is actually very common and the norm with first-time offenders. Also, the things I've found cops arrested for are generally the same things other middle-class blue-collar workers get in trouble for. Issues with substance abuse, particularly alcohol, and financial problems. My career is perfectly fine. I've faced absolutely no negative repercussions from any of my peers. I'd say if you work for a large enough agency, you've probably arrested or written a ticket to a cop. Not a cop, but a former dispatcher who filed a complaint against another dispatcher for jeopardizing public and officer safety. This person did not like me and would intentionally withhold information and not enter it into CAD, causing me on radio to have delays in responding to officer questions. When I finally had enough and reported this person to assistant chief, I was sent home. 2 days later I was fired for abandoning post, even though I never left. I called both the chief and the assistant chief out during my termination for this being a case of good old boys and collected my personal belongings. To this day people ask me all the time why is it when they call 911 at this particular city they get told hold. My response is usually that dispatcher is most likely finishing their game of Candy Crush first. The thin yellow line, dispatchers, and I hear the thin blue line, cops, are to never be crossed. You're either with them or against them. Not a cop yet. Yes, I know, but this is a hilarious story. The city police department had gotten their first internet computer in the early 2000s, and one of the two female officers was having trouble with the computer. She had spent an hour screaming, hitting, and yelling at it before pulling her gun out and shooting the computer. The other female officer, who is my sister's future mother-in-law, had to take her down and arrest her for unlawful use of a service weapon and destruction of municipal property. The charges were dropped because she asked if she could instead quit without her pension and benefits and go to therapy. Now she's been living life as a grandmother and helping kids with anger issues. Another issue, more serious. An officer, same PD, was charged and convicted of unlawfully manufacturing and selling firearms. He was building rifles and pistols and was using a pawn shop to help sell them because they had an FFL, federal firearms license, and was forcing the owner to sell him parts for a cheaper price. He was also found to be selling the drugs he took off of people. The police department has taken so many hits from these incidents that the city forces them to have multiple cameras in the cars. All officers have to have body cameras they can't turn off unless they are going to the bathroom, which they have to do in the department. They also can't have their guns directly on them at their desks. They have to be locked in a safe next to their desk to deter them from pulling it out and shooting a computer. I have decided not to work there and to find employment with a department that has a better reputation, which sadly is hard. My friend worked as a cop at a local city. He told us a story of how he was nearly arrested by a cop when he was a cop. He and 3 of his fellow officers were having a night of drunken antics related to a bachelor's party. At one point, while definitely intoxicated, his friend decided it was a good idea to throw a hot dog, covered in mustard and ketchup, at a uniformed officer from a neighboring town. Direct hit to the back of the head. Everyone was silent for a second, then the officer came over and started angrily talking to them. None of them could keep their composure because, well, the alcohol and the fact that condiments were dripping down this cop's neck as he spoke. Needless to say, they were thrown in the drunk tank, but never formally charged. In my shortish time in law enforcement, I never arrested another cop, although I did arrest correction officers, both for domestic violence related incidents. But I did have several officers I knew well who arrested officers from our agency, and even worked with a couple guys who ended up getting arrested. I only knew of one guy catching flack for arresting a fellow officer. The officer arrested was extremely well liked, and the offense was pretty iffy. The kind of thing you wouldn't typically arrest a random person for. However, it came out later that it was just the tip of the iceberg. Most cops I discussed these matters with really have no issue with you if you arrest another cop for legitimate reasons. Professional courtesy is definitely a thing. An officer will likely get the benefit of the doubt. If you commit a borderline act, an officer is likely to turn their head the other way. It's called officer discretion, and most officers will do the same for nurses, teachers, other first responders, or just someone who is kind. But if you have legitimately screwed up, you are most likely going to jail. The cops exist that will do everything they can not to arrest a fellow cop, but they are definitely rarer than the public thinks. Used to work for the police and arrested a few cops. First one was my first shift ever on the beat. I was walking around the city and had a complaint about an abusive guy who was calling women sluts and yelling about how ugly they are. I wasn't too fazed. I thought he was probably just drunk. As we walked over to speak with the guy, he started yelling about how he was in his right, and we all agreed. You can have an opinion, but just keep things quiet. It was a very simple conversation, and after taking his details to issue a ticket, he just snapped. He threw his briefcase at my partner and kicked him in the junk. Well, we had warrant for arrest, so took him down and cuffed him. As we took him down, his glasses broken on his face and cut him up a bit. Nothing major, so we took him back to the holding cell. At this point he said to me, "Did you know I have a 12-inch cock? And my real name is Joe Big Blow." We all had a laugh. I finally got some time to run his name through the system and boom. Police inspector. This is one of the highest ranks in Vicpol. So being an inspector I called my boss. She came in and said, "Oh freak, this guy used to teach at the academy, then he runs at her and tries to headbutt her. That doesn't go well and he ends up on the ground with a big lump on his head. Someone gave him a wall to headbutt instead. After a few hours he sobered up and was sent home. The court case carried on for 3 years. I've since left the force and he was fired shortly after that altercation." Like and subscribe for more Reddit videos.